just to highlight these stakeholders. Now, within the foundation, we have a core team that guides the conceptualization, the design, and the process. This is what drives the process. But this core team then works with a number of in-country data experts at the country level to collect the primary data, right? And here I must mention that the UNDP has been very supportive of this process and actually has always contributed towards expanding the coverage at the country level. So the report actually started out in 2001. The coverage was 34 countries. In 2011, 34 countries. 2012, 42 countries. Then 2013, 44 countries. But to oversee this data collection, we then liaise with a number of policy institutes and think tanks, right, who then act as focal points. So they provide oversight, they fact check, and then ensure field supervision such that the data that's collected is assessed even before it comes to the central point of the ACBF. But also, we realize that doing it alone is not feasible. So we source expertise globally, right, through a call for background papers. And so people that contribute, the goal is basically to get the best ideas on a competitive basis from all over the world, as well as from experts who are working in this area. We also work with a number of policy institutes and think tanks, but to ensure that what we're doing also, it has independent critique, interrogation, and insight, there's an external reference group, that's the ERG, that sits and then looks and then provides this guidance. Then once it's all done, of course, then the core team at ACBF pulls it together for the knowledge function, unique skills and relevance of our own operational activities. But again, to ensure that we have the buy-in, joint ownership, the critique, the validation, there are a series of validation workshops that are put together before the report finally comes out. So here is just to give you a picture of the coverage, right? This map was drawn prior to going to the field to actually put together this report. And all the countries in brown had been covered in the previous report. And the goal was to go from 42 to 46, right? So the target was to put Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, and Principe, Sao Tome and Principe as part of it. Well, because of developments in Egypt, right, the Arab Spring seems to be still going on. It was not possible to go to Egypt and collect data. And similarly, Algeria had its own challenges. So out of the 4 that were targeted, we only managed to collect in Tunisia and then Sao Tome and Principe. So if now to shade this map, Tunisia will be brown, Sao Tome and Principe will also be brown. The goal is that going forward, we'll be able to cover North Africa. And again, I apologize, there's supposed to be a line here for South Sudan. Yes. And we did collect the data for South Sudan, but it did not come in time for it to be included in the reports. Hence, we mentioned 44 countries, but it should be 45. But because we have the data, but it's not in the report, it says 44 countries. So why was it important to focus on capacity? As I did mention, if you look at the continent today, almost on a daily basis, if it's not oil in Ghana or in Uganda, it's natural gas in Mozambique, it's diamonds and platinum in Zimbabwe, it's uranium. Something is being found everywhere, literally on a daily basis. And we all do know that when natural resources are managed well, right, then it leads to growth, it creates employment, development, standard of living improve. On the other hand, if it's not, then we get stories of the resource chaos and other issues of conflict, tension, and you name it. So the governance was especially important. And this is even critical on the continent where we know that there are a lot of inequities, right? If it's not on ethnic lines, it might be just on social lines. And sometimes also these resources straddle national borders, so that it's not even, you're not only dealing with it internally, you're dealing with across borders. And I guess DRC stands out in terms of we know what is happening in that part of the world. So the failure to govern well then is what we get the CAAS. And we felt, look, increasingly this is being told, but it should be possible and that one can transcend this, and the CAAS should not always be something that happens. Also, there are other implications which were made important to study this. If you follow scholars like Collier, they argue that only about 20% of all the resource endowments in Africa have been discovered. Now, if this is true, it means we have almost 80% that has not been discovered, most probably in many countries has not even been mapped out, and people don't even know what is below the soil, which becomes very important because sometimes you have people coming in and say, look, we want to purchase land for farming, but there have been instances where the farming is used as a front and actually they are mining. And because nobody knows what is beneath, so it was important that one has to know what is there, to be able to map it, because it's only when you know what you have, you can map it, and you have the capacity, that you can even negotiate on how this should be extracted and ultimately developed. Then we also talk about the market potential and the demographic dividend, one, Africa's own population, but also in terms of global developments that are happening. And if Africa is going to move, the shift now towards regional integration, and especially when we have transboundary natural resource management issues, it's important. But also, if we look at the shift that's happening in Africa, increasingly one can argue that there are some political and economic reforms that are genuinely taking place. Now, within this changing landscape then, the resources do have a lot of implications in terms of what can be done and what can be done meaningfully. So all these then made it really critical that this issue needed to be studied and studied well. Now, I'm sure most of us, we all know about this old natural resource problem, so that much of the literature in the past will talk about, the asymmetries between weak states and strong external actors, the multinational corporations. You see this in, let's say, Nigeria, the oil extraction in Nigeria. You see this in Liberia in the past. You see this in Sierra Leone. You see this in many places where the state did not have the capacity to deal with the multinationals on an equal footing, either because of resources, because of skills, whatever. Again, you'd read about either the low or erratic commodity prices, unfair terms of trade, the issue of technology and managerial capacity, weak bargaining capacity, poor systems of taxation, lack of transparency, in such that when even there were windfalls, right, these would then only go to certain sections of the population, either the political elite or the rich or whatever, but did not generally benefit everybody across the landscape. Similarly, what we realized, there was lack of economic diversification, so they talk of the Dutch disease in certain places. Then the environmental challenges, again, you look at the Nigeria Delta, you see this sort of thing. So all put together, generally the discourse then kept talking about how it discredited this whole issue of natural resource-based development, right, as a viable model, and you see this a lot. Now, based on our findings, it appears that this landscape really is changing. Now, if you look at the emerging new developments and possibilities taking place on the continent, we see that there's a lot of growing state coherence with a strong policy framework. So increasingly, almost in every country, the policy environment is being strengthened. We see regional and sub-regional linkages. We see initiatives like the Africa Mining Vision. So many things are taking place. Now, even though one can argue that there's a relatively high commodity price market currently, and I think we argue that a lot of this will continue because of the demand from the BRICS, right? That China's resource needs are not going to stop anytime soon. So if this trend is to continue, one can argue that then the yields or the profits or the revenue from commodities will continue for a while. Increasingly also, we begin to see a lot of countries are investing in enhancing their technical capacity, be it the legal aspect so they can better sign contracts, be it actually the geosciences required, be it the management, right? And all this has come out of a recognition that, yes, you can buy capacity, but you need to have local capacity to move forward. So issues of training, you see in the case of Ghana, Tulu Oil partnering with the British Council to set up a scholarship to train people in this area. And we also see a lot of sophistication and a political will to bargain. I mean, this has come out of the strengthened civil society initiatives. So things like EITI, the Revenue Watch, the Publish What You Pay, the Kimberley process, right? And a number of things are transforming the landscape. But the civil society themselves increasingly have been capacitated, and some have very strong international links, which also then gives them certain leverage in terms of either dealing with the state, strengthening local communities to be able to better interface with multinationals and stuff like that. So what we're observing is that in terms of the dialogue space, there are new configurations, in terms of the public, the private, civil society, and local communities. The dialogue space itself is being transformed. We also see a lot of activism at the community level. So in terms of community-based natural resource management, African countries are signing into new initiatives, green growth, RED. We have national, international, environmental NGOs strengthening advocacy. But within countries, across countries, and at certain regional levels also, there's an extensive debate going on the value chain. What employment opportunities. There's a push, right, for people to invest for the future. So we see sovereign wealth funds. So it's not only Botswana. Angola set up a sovereign wealth fund. Nigeria set up one. Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Mozambique. All these countries are actually now going to invest for the future, so that not only are they utilizing some of the resources for now, but ensuring that they're also utilizing some for generations yet to be born. As a result of all these dynamics, right, there's more talk about missing revenue, more talk about holding multinationals accountable for their corporate social responsibilities, right? And then we also find that the disciplinary effects of the public's own expectations, external scrutiny, and democratic norms have generally created a certain landscape where increasingly everybody's rejecting black diamonds. People are moving away from conflict timber. People are holding companies accountable for the activities in the extractive industry, right? And then we see all these broader initiatives that go beyond the country level. We see the African Mining Vision, the African Peer Review Mechanism, right? There are multilateral efforts from the African Development Bank has set up this fund to actually help countries, right, secure the best legal expertise they can get to sign contracts. The World Bank is doing similar. Even the US government is doing similar. Then within the industry itself, there's a certain awareness that things cannot continue the same. So there are industry self-imposing or self-policing initiatives that are also pushing forth. Now, when you put all this together, we argue that, look, the landscape really has changed. Now, but let's look at the data. If one were to look at the strategic use of national resources for needs of today and tomorrow. Now, of the 45 countries that were interviewed, 22 have such policies in place, right? 50 have such policies in place, and they've embedded them into their national development strategies. However, there's still a big chunk, there's 27, almost 28% that do not have any such framework at all, right? So yes, you can argue that, and this is what we're saying, that the landscape definitely is shifting positively, but still more needs to be done. Let's look at the policy environment and the efficiency of instruments that countries have put in place for managing natural resources. Now, if you look at it, almost, I'd say about 56.2% of all the countries, right, have a very high policy environment. Very few of them, less than 1%, could be able to have a very low or low policy environment. But here again, we do know that in some countries, right, designing policy is like some of it is being designed internally. Sometimes you can buy the expertise to design the policy environment. But that in itself is still excellent. The fact that they've put together these frameworks is good. What was even more intense, if you look at the dialogue space between the state, the extractive industry, and surrounding communities, right? In many countries, you realize that increasingly civil society they have the space and the freedom to execute their mandates, which in itself is excellent. If you look at the ability of the legislature to, as a mechanism, right, to execute this mandate, and also you realize that, there's a lot of progress in that area. Yes, I mean, something like more needs to be done in terms of, let's say, a dialogue and a national dialogue platform. More needs to be done in terms of having cross-sectional dialogue platforms. But generally, some of these things one would not have seen, let's say, even in the 80s or early 90s. Again, we talked about training programs specifically. Many countries are investing resources, right? I remember when we were at Queen's, Botswana would send students, almost so many of them, year by year, to study mining engineering, to go back and help. Increasingly, many countries are doing similar, investing in local capacity to drive the process forward. Now, in terms of countries, let's look at Liberia. Post the war, the government of Johnson Sirleaf has re-signed and renegotiated almost all the contracts in the forest industry, right, to clean it up. They've used policy and institutional building and operational to curb corruption in illicit timber trade. Mozambique did similar, cancelling almost 1,500 investors because they're not complying. Nigeria gave statutory backing for the EITI. They've done a lot of work in supporting civil society in the dialogue space. Angola, Nigeria, followed Botswana in setting up, these sovereign wealth funds. Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Mozambique have established or are planning to. In Ethiopia, they're investing in higher education to build capacity, right, for natural resource management and ecotourism. Sierra Leone is doing similar with iron ore. So there are all these positive stories coming out, really stories that you have communities being empowered from the bottom up and the state, civil society, working together to ensure that it's sustainable. Now, if we look here, right, in terms of computing the index, right, we looked at 4 key areas. So the policy environment, processes for implementation, development results, and capacity development outcomes. And okay, these were, I'm just going to say a few of the top performers. So Rwanda came out tops, right? Then of course there's Ghana, Namibia, Botswana. But look, Nigeria, right? And a lot, those of you who've been following Nigeria would argue that a lot has been done in recent years, right, for Nigeria actually to move forward. So increasingly, a lot of countries are actually pushing and strengthening to ensure that, when it comes to these resources that they are finding, they can actually manage them well and manage them effectively. So all put together, the argument is that today we see a new, complex, evidence-based and participatory vision for natural resource management. And then this is much more, it's more, if you look at the stakeholders, it's more diversified and with an empowered portfolio. All right. The implication is that real growth and transformation based on natural resources is possible. I mean, increasingly, if you look at now, most of the literature coming out, nobody will argue that the natural resource CAAS is inevitable. The dialogue is now shifting so that we need to focus on the emphasis of capacity, leadership, knowledge sharing, and good governance. But how has this happened? Part of this has happened because people just learned the hard way, right? I think not only was it very costly, both for the multinationals, for the governments, for local communities. So, after a time you realize it doesn't work and people need to change. Hence this whole new normative policy environment, where all the stakeholders are subjected to, a new environment as evidenced by strong natural resource policy environment that we see. So in terms of the policy environment, a lot has been done. The policy frame, all these speak to new spaces of agency. Yes, but somebody will argue that, right, agency is unrealized potential. And we agree. But then what can be done? An argument is that to transform that agency into realized, actual results, one needs to build the capacity of all the stakeholders. It's not just the local communities, it's not civil society, it's not the state, it's not only multinationals. All the stakeholders along the value chain need to be capacitated in certain ways. In the eyes of ACBF, we're saying that you can do this if you move along the path from the policy environment to processes of implementation, the development results at the country level, and ultimately you get to capacity development outcomes. So here, I just wanted to show you what the results look like. So if you look at the policy environment, right, you realize that almost 84% have a very high policy environment. I mean, so I'll say 100% have a high or very high policy environment. Now, if you come to processes of implementation, you realize that, yes, some are doing well, but the bulk of the countries are actually sitting in the high. If you go to development results, what happens? Now you have like medium capacity, right? With very few, only 2.3% have very high capacity there. But when you come to capacity development outcomes, look at what happens. Most of them are low. And this is something that has been observed and was discussed in Busan and stuff. So this is not new. But so actually, one needs to then move in terms of along this line to ensure that you can actually achieve your outcomes. But again, for those of you, who follow, once you have this S-curve, you know that with a little creativity, a little innovation, a little strengthening, definitely things will get to where are needed. And I think a lot of African countries realize this, and then want to move in this area. Yes, there are challenges, but definitely the trend seems to speak that they'll be moving in that area. So, in conclusion, I want to say that if one looks at the landscape today, definitely we observe it's good, but more needs to be done. All the stakeholders involved in the value chain need to be capacitated. From the prospecting, extraction, processing, marketing, management, all these things need enhancing. But to do that, we need a certain element of transformational or development-oriented leadership. We need independent, accountable, and transparent regulatory institutions. We need deepened capacity building interventions for learning and experience sharing. Also, we need to strengthen our coordinating and integrating planning agencies. The political will to advance good governance is critical, and this will also need to be pushed forward. But generally, if one looks at the winds of change, not only are they reflected in these scores, but also from different sources, we observe the growth patterns taking place, the improved human development indices, the stories about good governance and leadership that are coming from different corners of the continent. And I think one puts this together, you can definitely say that the continent is, the landscape, the natural resource landscape is shifting positively, but there are certain key things, and I think leadership and governance are critical to this process. I think I'll end on that note, because then Peter will take over and speak more to the issue of why governance is critical. Thank you so much.
I'll continue from where my colleague Kobina basically left off. There'll be some, should I say, similarities, but my focus will be much more on the governance aspect of natural resource management. And I have a series of issues to look at. The idea is, we hear so much about the so-called resource curse, or what some have called the paradox of the plenty. The general expectation is that once natural resources is discovered in a country, well, everybody, hooray, we're going to make money, the economy is going to grow, there'll be all kinds of positive spin-off from these activities. But is that really the reality for many developing countries? There have been a whole host of arguments to the effect that, well, the mere existence of natural resources is not actually going to improve the socioeconomic conditions of the countries where these resources are exploited amongst others. So why the resource curse? Or the counter argument is the resource curse inevitable? Why shouldn't there be efforts to improve one's economic situation once these resources are basically discovered in a particular country? And the issue then ties into the second point I raised. What kinds of interventions could be put in place to ensure that resources actually rather than contributing to violence, low economic development amongst others, actually helps in promoting socioeconomic improvements? And the argument always boils down to how effectively are these resources actually managed by countries amongst others? And the core argument I'm going to make is that there are two variables to this particular point. And The first being that the inequity, which sometimes the unequal distribution of what benefits is one of the core problems with the so-called resource curse. Because once the resources are not being equitably distributed within a particular society, then it gives reason for concerns to be raised amongst others. And why the inequity? Some of these inequities might be a function of poor governance in a particular environment or a particular country. How the governance structures in place would ultimately contribute to how effectively that particular resources is managed and how equitably those particular resources are distributed amongst others. So the core argument I'm going to make is that good governance involves not only transparency, accountability, public participation in the sense of having central roles for the media, civil society, amongst others. And obviously there's the last argument with capacity building, but since my colleague Kobina Hansen has already touched on that dimension, I'll probably skip a little bit on that. So the core issues I'll be raising relates to the governance dimension, the importance of good governance, and central roles for the media and civil society in this particular process. So let's, in doing this, let's quickly take a look at some of the existing literature on the natural resource curse, amongst others. There's been a whole host of research by Collier, Terrelin, Carl, amongst others, just to name a few, who've come to the conclusion that countries with natural resources generally tend to do poorly economically compared to countries which don't have natural resources. The issue always crops up. How is that possible? Because the idea is that you have something which is quite valuable. So how come with all these valuable natural resources you are not doing as well as one would have anticipated? And their core argument relates to the fact that ultimately it stems from various arguments. The whole idea of the Dutch disease being one dimension. The Dutch disease being that ultimately, because those resources are in existence, there's so much focus on those particular resources at the expense of other sectors of the economy. I think that particular argument was first discovered in Holland, hence the so-called Dutch disease, that there was so much focus on that particular resource development at the expense of other sectors of the economy, be it manufacturing, service, what have you. So once those resources become depleted, ultimately what happens? You are found wanting amongst others. So that's one dimension of how having natural resources might actually contribute to poor socioeconomic development. And obviously we can't also ignore the role of corruption and mismanagement in I mean, you look at the case of Nigeria. Who would have thought that Nigeria since 1960 or 1970, when large amounts of oil were discovered, would still be one of the relatively poorest countries on the continent of Africa? I mean, it boggles one's mind to come to such a conclusion, but ultimately the issue of mismanagement, the issue of corruption, the lack of transparency amongst others have all contributed to the sorrowful state in which Nigeria's economy tends to find itself. The second point is that not only is the existence of natural resources not going to contribute to socioeconomic development, but in actual fact it's also going to contribute to should I say, instability within a particular country. I mean, that particular argument has been advanced by Philippe Lebellion. I'm sure some of you who might have done some work in that area would have come across much of his work. I mean, his core argument is that rather than contributing to socioeconomic development, natural resources might actually serve as the basis of political conflict. I mean, look at the case of the DRC. Look at the case of the Niger Delta region, amongst others. And why is that the case? Alienation, despair, lack of opportunities, amongst others, might ultimately might lead to a situation where frustrated individuals might think that the only course of action available for them would be to engage in some kind of insurgency activity or engage in some kind of instability activities, amongst others. Then the final point is that ultimately all these become possible simply because of the failure of the state. When there is state failure, when there are the lack of institutional arrangements, or where there are the absence of the necessary structures in place to ensure that things are managed in the way one would expect it to be managed, then ultimately it's, as somebody called it, becomes the honeypot that attracts predation. So state failure, I mean, just imagine a country like Somalia. I don't think Somalia per se has any particular resources, but just imagine if Somalia or any country which is so-called failed finds any particular natural resources. Who is going to manage those resources in those particular countries, amongst others? So ultimately, the idea is that once a state is failed, I mean, although I sometimes have certain concerns with the whole notion of state failure, amongst others, that's for another discussion. But for the purposes of arguments, let's take the argument that ultimately, where there is state failure, what happens? Resources might not be managed as equitably, effectively, or in an efficient manner to promote socio-economic development. So that is the argument you find within the literature. But is it a given that ultimately, once you have resources, things are going to go downward? Not necessarily. I mean, there's been counter arguments. I mean, we've recently, since, should I say, about 10 years ago, seen a number of arguments cropping up saying that, look, challenging the mainstream argument that natural resources ultimately leads to the resource CAAS. And you find arguments by Lay and Basidiou to the effect that, look, it is much more complex than what is been portrayed in the so-called mainstream media. And that's the mere existence of resources like oil, amongst others, or mineral resources, amongst others, would not necessarily lead to conflict. It depends on the capabilities of the state. So having those resources, again, it ties into the argument of state failure, which I raised earlier. Having those resources would not necessarily automatically contribute to instability amongst others. It depends on the capacity and capabilities of the state amongst others. So these are some of the counter arguments which have emerged recently to challenge, should I say, the dominant paradigm regarding the whole idea of the resource CAAS. But having said that, I mean, like I said, it would be disingenuous for us to ignore the realities that having resources is always a huge challenge. The issue of who gets what, when and how, amongst others, always crops up. And there's some evidence to support the fact that natural resources always comes with particular challenges. And so nobody's trying to push the problem under the rug. It's always a challenge which one has to confront. But there's always the issue of what do you do to ensure that these resources become what they are supposed to achieve for a particular country, amongst others. And to that effect, we see a number of initiatives which have recently come to the forefront in terms of ensuring that, quote unquote, natural resources become a blessing as opposed to the so-called resource CAAS that we've heard so much about. One of the, should I say, most significant relates to the so-called Kimberley Process Certification Scheme, which my colleague Kobina Hansen touched on. The basic argument of the Kimberley process is that it is aimed at preventing the sale of blood diamonds. I mean, that is a basic idea behind it. I'm sure some of us have seen the movie about, what's the title? Is it Blood Diamonds, amongst others, where that's Hollywood for you, trying to take a complex issue to, I don't know whether to simplify it or what have you, etc. But the basic argument is that it's trying to prevent blood diamonds from getting into the legitimate commerce, if you may put it that way. But I'm sure everybody knows how diamonds are, very small. How do you control it? So in that regard, there's always the issue of, is that a very effective way of ensuring that these resources are basically managed effectively? There are a whole host of problems or challenges with the Kimberley process as a mechanism for ensuring that resources are managed very well. On the one hand, it is also besides the size of the diamonds, it's also voluntary. So there's always a challenge of a weak enforcement mechanism. I mean, countries decide anything voluntary. I mean, I'm sure we've been following the news in the Bangladeshi crash, the building that collapsed a couple of days ago. I mean, what is Loblaw saying? Oh, well, we're going to compensate the people. Why do they want to compensate them? Well, because they are in the news for all the kinds of wrong reasons. So it's voluntary. I mean, nothing of that nature. So long as there's lack of enforcement mechanisms behind a particular initiatives, countries choose and decide, or businesses choose and decide whether they are going to follow it or not, amongst others. So ultimately, I mean, I've listed a whole host of what challenges with, or the problems with this Kimberley process, amongst others. You have countries like Angola, Russia, and China who are basically saying that, look, they don't want to disclose some of these particular, should I say, revenue sources, amongst others, because it's part of their national security. They don't want to expose, should I say, how they do their business for the sake of what? Their competitors having an economic advantage. So in a way, whilst it's a good initiative, some of these particular problems means that their goals are always not what attainable. I'm not in any way saying that these are what not good initiatives, but then we have to find ways of what tightening the mechanisms to ensure that these particular goals become reality, amongst others. Then we also have the EITI, again, which you see a country like Nigeria being in the forefront of what? Promoting the EITI initiatives. I mean, the whole idea behind the EITI is to promote some kind of what? Transparency. Countries they publish what they basically, the revenue dimensions of what the businesses in those particular sectors, amongst others. And there's been some notable progress. I mean, there are a whole host of African countries which have signed on to the EITI initiatives, amongst others. So in a way, governments through civil society are being held accountable in terms of, should I say, there's some aspect of what transparency in terms of what governments is publishing, the revenue, amongst others, which they are getting from these particular areas, etc. But ultimately, we can't ignore the fact that, again, similar to the problems of the Kimberley process, I mean, the revenue that government gets, natural resources it's only a percentage of it. So the idea is not every aspect of government's financial activity is published. So where do you draw the line? I mean, is it simple enough to say, well, we've published information on natural resources, so should we take it that the government is doing similarly in all areas? It doesn't work that way. And again, there's always the challenge of what breaches of confidentiality between what business partners, similar to the Kimberley process, which I touched on, amongst others. So that is where ultimately, I've been signaling that I have 5 minutes, so I'll quickly go through it. That is where the whole idea of what governance comes into play, because we see that ultimately all these initiatives have a common theme behind them. The whole idea of what? Practicing good governance. And good governance is one of those, should I say, elusive terms. I mean, it's thrown around so much that sometimes it loses its efficacy, if I may put it that way. But ultimately, there are certain core dimensions of the good governance argument. There's the whole idea of what? Transparency. Transparency, we're talking about the access by citizens to relevant information, particularly on what? Mobilization of revenue, allocation of government expenditure. So long as the government is transparent on how much is coming from a particular resource sector, how much is being spent, amongst others, ultimately some of the challenges or problems which have bedeviled the natural resource sector can be nipped in the bud, because so long as we know that, look, this is how much the government spends and this is where the government is going, nobody can make the argument that, well, the government is mismanaging funds or basically misusing the funds for purposes for which it's not supposed to, amongst others. Then there's also the whole idea of what? Accountability. Accountability ensuring that, look, people don't take advantage of what? The natural resource. I mean, unfortunately, I hope there isn't any Nigerian here, because when I say my Nigerian friends are not very happy with it. I mean, there are lots of what? Very rich people in Nigeria. How did they get rich? I mean, the political leaders. I mean, not that people don't do genuine business, but ultimately, the general perception is that ultimately political elites take advantage of their positions to what? Exploit those resources for their own selfish ends, as opposed to what? Promoting the general public good, amongst others. So holding government officials or anybody involved accountable, knowing the process, amongst others, is also what? Very key to this whole process of what? Accountability, amongst others. Then there's also what? The rule of law. Knowing exactly equal application of the law becomes equally what? Crucial. I mean, it ties into the governance structures, amongst others. Then there's also participation by stakeholders to ensure effective design of what? Government programs. Participation not only by stakeholders, but by the general public, amongst others. Once you participate in something, it provides more legitimacy to that particular process, amongst others. So these are some of the, should I say, core variables with the whole process of what good governance, which one can think about in various shapes or form. Then obviously you need an informed media to what? To be part of the process. I mean, if the media is actually performing its functions, I mean, we heard so much about the role of what? ICT, amongst others, in electoral processes yesterday, and other roles, amongst others. So if the media is informed, I mean, the unfortunate thing is that the media can also be ill-informed on certain issues. It's simply not enough to have a media in place. The media has to know exactly what it has to report and to play its role, be it watchdogging, be it dissemination of information amongst it. The traditional role of the media, if it performs those roles and responsibilities, then ultimately some dimensions can be found. And then the role of civil society. And obviously we see that the Kimberley process, the EITIs, amongst others, were all initiatives where civil society has heavily been involved. And I mean, civil society is crucial in that particular sense because it can shine a light, similar to the role of the media, on what is taking place on particular issues. Although sometimes people accuse the civil society of being working in the interest of external actors, amongst others. I mean, we can't dispute that fact, or we can't ignore those dimensions, but ultimately civil society is plays a crucial role in that particular aspect. And to add to that, we see the case of Botswana. Botswana, for all its challenges and problems. I mean, my colleague talked about the number of Botswana students. It was a joke amongst us that every Botswana student you saw on Queen's campus when we were graduate students was doing something related to mining engineering. I mean, it was part of their capacity building initiatives. But there was more to what Botswana was doing during those particular times. I mean, their diamond resources, they had a so-called rainy day fund to plan for the future. They've also put in place, should I say, they have the aspects of should I call it, the good governance initiatives, which many countries generally tend to lack in various shapes and forms, amongst others. So ultimately, some would say that Botswana can be held as an example or a model for which other African countries can aspire to. I mean, for many developed countries, the example is always Norway. I mean, when Ghana got oil, the first thing is that, they brought in the Norwegians to, should I say, pick their brains on how they've gone about the process of ensuring that the resources are managed effectively, efficiently, all the buzzwords that one tends to hear. But by and large, in the face of good governance, one can't ignore how much equitably distributing the benefits would ultimately contribute to stability in a particular country. Because so long as people feel marginalized, frustrated, they don't seem to get a fair shake of the resources, then it's likely they will take to other means to try to ensure that their interests are being met, etc. Okay? I see the signal. So I'll be done, and then we can have time.